Mark and Julia Rivers were the couple everyone admired, the ones who smiled at block parties and handed out warm cookies. But behind the neat blue shutters of their perfect home, they were preserving something far darker than their families' reputation, and it all started with what they hid in their garage. In a quiet suburb surrounded by rows of identical houses, the Rivers family seemed like the perfect neighbors. Their white house with blue shutters always looked freshly painted, and the grass in their front yard was trimmed in neat lines. Every Sunday afternoon, while the sun set behind them, the father, Mark Rivers, worked at an insurance company downtown and wore crisp shirts and a tie, waving to neighbors as he left for work every morning exactly at 7:15, coffee in hand. His wife, Julia, ran a small home bakery, and the smell of fresh bread and cookies often floated from the open kitchen window in the early mornings. She would pack homemade cookies in small paper bags for the children on the street during Halloween, and smile warmly at neighbors, asking about their families with genuine interest. Their teenage son, Danny, was on the soccer team at the local high school, and in the evenings, he would practice with his friends in the front yard, kicking the ball back and forth with laughter and light-hearted teasing. Their younger daughter, Lily, loved to ride her pink bicycle up and down the driveway, her laughter ringing like a bell, with colorful streamers fluttering from the handlebars. The Rivers decorated their house for every holiday, pumpkins and cheerful scarecrows in the fall, strings of white and blue lights in winter, and bright flowers on the porch in the spring. Their garage door, painted to match the shutters, was always kept shut, and the neighbors never paid much attention to it, assuming it hid a neatly organized space like the rest of the house appeared to be. Mark was known to help neighbors with fixing leaky faucets and mowing lawns for the elderly, never asking for anything in return. Julia offered freshly baked bread to new families who moved into the neighborhood, saying it was her way of welcoming them. At church on Sundays, the Rivers sat in the second row, heads bowed, hands joined, whispering prayers with eyes closed. They attended every neighborhood block party, and their table was always filled with the most delicious cakes, pies, and sandwiches, quickly disappearing as neighbors complimented Julia's baking skills. They posed for photos, their smiles bright, arms around each other, looking like the kind of family everyone wished they could be. The children were well behaved, always saying please and thank you, never causing trouble, and getting good grades. At school, neighbors would often comment on how lucky the Rivers were to have such a peaceful and happy family life, admiring their kindness and their calm, steady way of living. Nobody ever saw anything strange around the Rivers' home, and nothing ever seemed out of place. Packages were delivered and quickly brought inside, and groceries were carried in with the same quiet efficiency as everything else the family did. The garage door would sometimes make a low mechanical sound late at night, but people assumed it was Mark working on small home improvement projects, fixing tools or cleaning the car, just like any other responsible father would do to take care of his family. The bright flower beds, the smiling faces, and the warm, comforting smell of cookies from the kitchen window formed the perfect mask that hid the dark secret the Rivers family was keeping, a secret that sat quietly just beyond the neat garage door that no one ever dared to question, believing that nothing could be wrong in a house so perfect, with a family that smiled so brightly in the light of day. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, unnoticed by most, like a shadow passing across a window on a bright day. It began with the faint smell, something sour that drifted across the sidewalk in the evenings when the wind changed direction. At first, people thought it was the drains clogging up again, as they often did after heavy rain, or maybe a dead animal somewhere in the hedges. The Rivers neighbors would wrinkle their noses, glance at each other, and shake their heads, deciding to ignore it because it was easier to believe it would pass. The smell grew stronger as summer heat settled over the neighborhood, hanging heavy in the humid air, lingering around the driveway and across the perfectly trimmed lawn of the Rivers home. Children playing on the sidewalk would pause, sniff the air, and move further down the street, but they never said anything to their parents. The mailman started to hurry past the Rivers mailbox, delivering letters with quick movements while holding his breath, eager to get down the street to fresher air. Delivery drivers mentioned the scent when dropping off boxes on the doorstep, but Julia would smile politely and say it was probably a spill in the trash bins, nothing to worry about, she would take care of it later. Neighbors brought up the smell quietly to each other during morning walks or while watering their gardens, sharing looks of mild concern, but reassuring themselves that the Rivers were clean, kind people who would never let something rot around their home. Mark told the men next door that the smell might be from old paint cans in the garage, promising he would clear them out soon, laughing lightly as if it was nothing. Julia reassured a concerned neighbor that she had already called a plumber, suspecting the outside drain was clogged and that it would be fixed in a few days. But the days turned into weeks, and the smell grew sharper, sour, with a hint of something no one could identify, something that made people's stomachs turn when they caught it unexpectedly. On hot afternoons, the scent would drift through open windows of nearby houses, making families pause their conversations, turn off the stove to check for burnt food, or spray air fresheners in hopes of pushing it away. No one wanted to confront the Rivers directly because they were such a friendly, helpful family. They chose to keep their distance and mind their own business, trusting the family's calm reassurances. The Rivers' children continued playing outside, riding their bikes and waving at neighbors, smiling with the same cheerful innocence as always. Mark continued his morning routine, driving off with a wave, returning in the evening with a grocery bag in hand, walking up the driveway with his tie slightly loosened, looking tired but content. Julia's baking continued, the warm scent of bread briefly covering the foul air each morning, before fading again, letting the heavy smell return as the sun rose higher. The garage door stayed closed, sometimes vibrating with a low hum as if something inside was running, but no one asked about it directly. At night, when the streets were empty, the smell would cling to the mist, seeping into dreams, making neighbors wake up with an uneasy feeling they could not explain. Still, the Rivers smiled and kept their routines, and the neighborhood told itself that nothing was wrong, because it was easier to believe in the perfect picture than to question the darkness quietly leaking from the shadows of the neatly shut garage door. The electric company sent out a notice about unusually high power usage in the neighborhood, warning residents to check their appliances to avoid excessive bills. Most people found the letter tucked between flyers and local ads, barely giving it a second glance. But the Rivers' house was different. Their bill had nearly doubled in the past 2 months, something the system flagged for a manual check. One morning, a meter reader arrived in a dusty utility truck, clipboard in hand, and walked up the Rivers' driveway, noticing the smell before he even reached the side of the house. It clung to the air, a thick, sour odor that made him pause, pressing his lips together as he tried to breathe through his mouth while working. He reached the side panel near the garage, kneeling down to open the metal cover, glancing around as if hoping no one would notice how uncomfortable he felt. While recording the numbers, he heard a low hum coming from the garage, a deep, vibrating sound that rattled faintly against the concrete floor. Condensation trickled down the small, dusty window of the garage, leaving streaks across the glass. It was unusual for a garage to be so warm and yet have moisture building up, as if something inside was fighting against the heat. He leaned closer, squinting, trying to see past the dust and grime on the window, and noticed a layer of fog on the inside, with shapes moving slightly as if swaying in a slow, rhythmic way. Plastic sheets, he thought, maybe covering tools or furniture, but there was something else, something that looked like it had been hung or draped, shifting gently with the vibration of whatever machine was running inside. He backed away quickly, finishing the numbers, writing them down with a shaking hand before closing the panel. The smell seemed worse near the window, sharp and almost metallic, catching in the back of his throat. He coughed as he returned to his truck, wiping sweat from his forehead while glancing back at the house, noticing how quiet everything was. Despite the hum coming from the garage, before leaving the neighborhood, he flagged the reading in the system, noting the high power usage, the smell, and the odd noise, recommending it for a supervisor review. It was a routine action for him, a small detail among dozens of checks he did each week, but it was the first official note that something might not be right at the Rivers home. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to talk quietly, glancing at the house when they walked by, whispering about the smell and the noise. Children stopped playing as close to the driveway, crossing the street to avoid the sharp scent that spilled into the air around the garage. Dogs pulled away when passing, tails tucked, sniffing and whining as they dragged their owners along the sidewalk. Still, nothing changed. The Rivers kept their perfect routine, Mark leaving every morning at the same time, Julia baking her bread, the children playing under the warm sun, waving at the neighbors as they passed, smiling as if nothing was wrong. The garage door remained shut, humming softly, condensation dripping from the window, hiding what was inside, while the family's life continued, wrapped in quiet secrecy that no one dared to challenge.
A storm rolled over the neighborhood on a late Friday evening, dark clouds pressing low against the roofs while heavy rain fell in sheets that washed the streets clean. Thunder cracked above, shaking windows, and lightning flashed across the sky, turning the familiar houses into harsh shadows for a brief second at a time. In the Rivers home, the lights flickered as the storm worsened, till finally the entire street went dark, leaving only the sound of rain pounding on roofs and the wind rattling tree branches against windows. The neighbors lit candles and checked on their children, pulling curtains closed to keep the warmth inside while the storm raged outside. At the Rivers house, the hum that had always come from the garage stopped abruptly when the power failed, leaving a heavy silence that settled like dust in the darkness. For the first time in months, the vibration that neighbors had become used to hearing in the background was gone, replaced by the sound of the storm. But then, in the middle of the downpour, a loud beeping started to echo across the driveway, followed by a shrill alarm that cut through the rain. The garage door jolted, the motor clicking and straining, and slowly, the door began to lift, catching on something inside before grinding to a halt, leaving it hanging open just enough to see underneath. Across the street, a neighbor who couldn't sleep noticed the movement from his window. He saw the light flashing from the alarm and the door hanging halfway open, rain splashing into the dark space under it. The neighbor pulled on a raincoat and stepped into the storm, walking across the street with water soaking his shoes, telling himself he was just helping shut a door before the Rivers came home or noticed him. Hard, stronger than it had ever been, thick and foul, carried by the wet air. He gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, blinking rain from his eyes as he leaned down to grab the edge of the door. Then he saw what was inside. The dim light from the alarm blinking just enough to reveal shelves lined along the garage walls, every inch covered with glass jars that reflected the light in brief, sharp flashes. The jars were filled with dark liquids and something floated. In each one, shapes that were hard to identify, but clearly not tools or craft supplies. The neighbor's eyes scanned the jars, realizing they were carefully labeled with dates and numbers, lined up neatly as if someone had spent hours making. Sure, Each one was in its place. The cracked open freezer in the corner leaked cold mist onto the floor, the faint glow inside revealing plastic bags stacked on top of each other. Sealed and marked with more dates, the contents inside pressed against the plastic in shapes that looked too defined, too human to be leftovers or meat. The neighbor stumbled back, slipping in the rain, eyes wide as the smell seemed to close in on him, making it hard to breathe. He turned and ran back across the street, slipping into his house as he grabbed the phone with shaking hands, dialing the police while looking out the window. Watching the garage door swaying slightly in the wind, the flashing light of the alarm, blinking like a warning in the storm. Across the street, the Rivers house remained dark and silent. The rest of the family unaware, or pretending not to know that their secret was no longer hidden, exposed to the night by the storm that tore open the neat mask they had so carefully kept in place.
When the police arrived, the storm was still pouring rain over the neighborhood, washing the streets and leaving puddles that reflected the red and blue lights of the patrol cars. Officers stepped carefully across the driveway, their boots splashing in the water as they approached the half-open garage. They shone their flashlights into the dark space, and the beams caught on the glass jars, lighting up rows of them like staring eyes, each holding the dark shape suspended in thick liquid. The officers paused, exchanging looks before moving inside, the smell hitting them immediately, heavy and rotten, sticking to their clothes and making their eyes water. They moved past the shelves to the cracked freezer, opening it fully to see the bags inside, carefully labeled with dates and numbers, stacked with precision. Each bag contained parts, unmistakably human, pressed against the plastic, pale and frozen, waiting quietly in the cold. Inside the house, the Rivers family sat in the living room, silent, the glow of candles flickering across their faces. Mark's hands were folded in his lap, Julia's eyes were lowered, and the children sat close together on the couch, their faces pale but calm. They did not resist when the officers entered, asking them to stand and guiding them outside into the rain, placing them into the waiting cars as neighbors watched from behind curtains, faces pale in the glow of the flashing lights. No one spoke, and the only sounds were the rain hitting the cars and the low voices of the officers communicating on their radios. As the investigation unfolded, the horrifying truth of the Rivers family began to surface, shocking the entire neighborhood. Mark, working in the insurance company, had discovered a way to access unclaimed bodies, quietly taking parts before they were disposed of, convincing himself that he was preserving a part of them to bring them back one day. He documented each one carefully, labeling and storing them in the garage, believing he was building a collection that would be important for the future, something that only he could understand. Julia had helped him, cleaning and preparing the parts, sealing them in jars with chemicals she researched in old medical books, stacking them in the garage with quiet dedication. The children, too young to understand, had been told it was a family project, something special they were doing together, helping to label the jars with neat handwriting as they learned their letters. Thinking it was a strange but harmless activity, the neighbors who had always admired the Rivers' perfect smiles and kind gestures now found themselves replaying every interaction, wondering how they had never seen the darkness behind the polite waves and cheerful conversations. The house was sealed by the authorities, the garage cleared out, the jars carefully removed and cataloged, each one a piece of the hidden horror that had been sitting just beyond the closed door while the family lived their quiet, perfect life. The front lawn grew over with weeds as weeks passed, the once bright flower beds wilting under the summer heat, the house now a dark presence on the street that people crossed to avoid, unable to look at it without remembering what was found inside. The Rivers family's holiday decorations, The smiling photos and the smell of fresh cookies from Julia's kitchen became memories laced with dread for the neighbors. Reminders that behind the neatest doors and the brightest smiles, the darkest secrets could be hidden, waiting quietly, while the world outside believed in the illusion of a perfect family living an ordinary life.